So, questions then. Is anybody, I think we've got a few minutes where we can go for questions. And if anybody's got a question, feel free to ask. You don't have to agree with me. I won't be offended and I won't jump down your throat. It's a safe place, this. We're not, you know, I'm provoking people to think, but not condemning anyone who has a different point of view.
I've got a question, because obviously I'm more sort of scientifically orientated. I did an engineering. I looked into this quite deeply. I read the debates on by the IDP creation versus evolution. This one, previews and creation.
Oh yeah, I think it might have been your.
Yes, I submitted a question.
Yes, I've got that.
I mean, I've actually asked the AOG for national guidelines, because there's so much people aren't sure what's supposed to be really.
Yeah, you're right.
With all the different opinions. Now, the young earthers in these debates, they did say, as I quoted in the email, as it is now interpreted, the data are mostly against us. Well and good, we take this seriously. Eventually, failure to deal with that data in a recent creationist scientific theory would be sufficient reason to give up projects. Recent creationists should humbly agree that their view is at the moment implausible on purely scientific grounds.
Okay, let me answer that.
Right, okay.
First of all, much as I don't disrespect the two men involved, Mark Reynolds and Paul Nelson. Paul Nelson's a good guy. I can honestly say that what they wrote there is utterly non-representative of every creationist I've ever known and rubbed shoulders with and read. And I've been reading this my entire adult life. I have never met a creationist who would say, the data are mostly against us. It just isn't the case. I don't believe that for a moment. That book was in 2003, and I would say this, that Paul Nelson and Mark Reynolds, they're not known to have written any creation books. I've seen Paul Nelson on some videos. He's a good guy, but I think he was conceding too much. I don't know what made him say that, and his colleague, that the data is mostly against us. I've given you information that, for me, is much more in support of the creation position, and Florin and me today will be doing more of that. Later on in the day, I'll share something about dinosaurs, and particularly soft unfossilized tissue found in dinosaurs. That's very, 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 very confronting to the person who believes in millions of years. And there are many, many things now which I believe are hugely problematic for the evolutionists. I just quoted an atheist who came from being the world's most notorious atheist in the whole last half of the 20th century to accepting there was a designing God. So I think that book is not representative. I think they concede too much. It's always good to admit when you've got weaknesses, or I don't profess to know all the answers to all the questions, but I do believe that the creationist view is superior even just as a model, in that it has intellectually satisfying answers, where evolution, people accuse us of having a God of the gaps. Oh, you say you don't know the answer, God must have done it. Now, if you formulate the argument for design, if you put it forward in this way, well, look at this amazing thing. I have no idea how that could have possibly got there but God must have done it. That's a God of the gaps. It's not wrong to have faith and not know how, but it's sort of the most amazing thing is people could accuse you of being credulous. You believe anything. And that is not what we're saying. We're looking at complex things, and we're saying the complexity tells us of precision engineering, precisely ordered, configured, arranged. It's all coded in the DNA, information technology par excellence. And that, based on what we know, not on our gaps in our knowledge, based on what we know, when we see parallels in engineering or medicine or science, it's telling us of a super intelligence behind it. And then the other side is, when a person like me challenges, say, an evolutionist to say, well, what about the soft tissue in dinosaur bones? They say, well, yes, we admit that's a massive problem, but we're confident that with more research, we will find an answer to that, for how you preserve soft tissue for tens of millions of years, when it, at the moment, rots away in a few weeks at the most. How do you that? No, that's a science of the gaps, or an evolutionist of the gaps. It's appealing to something that may be found in the future. So there's bad thinking on both sides of any argument, and that applies to creationists sometimes. and we have to be honest. If we've taken a step of faith, we should call it faith. But if we are calling something which is a step of faith a scientific fact, we have to stand back from that. So, for example, I hold a fossil. I can measure its size, shape, colour, texture, smell. Everything can be done in the present. We can agree on all of that. But the minute we ask how old is it, one person may say, well, I think it must have been from the time of Noah's flood, it must be thousands of years old. Another person says, well, I think it's millions of years old. Both people are exercising faith based on their worldview. None of them can date the fossil. Never in the history of the science of paleontology has a single fossil ever been dated by radioactivity, for the single reason that there's no radioactivity in fossils. So we both have to exercise faith when it comes to the age. The age of something is therefore not a fact. And so there are facts and interpretations on both sides.
The problem is there's different issues within this debate. Now, one of them is the age of the Earth. One of them is creation. I mean, the old Earth creationists, Phillip Johnson of the intelligent design camp,
Yes.
says he sees nothing hopeful in this suggestion of a young Earth. I mean, you've got things like the speed of light, the continental drift. You've got the reversal of magnetic fields. You've got the geological strata, which no good geological model can explain some of the bending of the rocks, even a fraction of the flood model.
Well, I would say to you, reserve judgment until you've heard Florian, because Phillip Johnson is a very clever guy, Berkeley law professor, but he's no geologist. And whilst there are geologists who believe what he says, I mean, I studied some geology at university for what it's worth, but I don't profess to be an expert. I saw things when I was in geology fieldwork back in the 1980s in the Pyrenees that puzzled me greatly as a committed evolutionist long earther, as a Christian. Subsequently, having become a creationist, I see the same evidence and I can make perfect sense of it within a flood model that's consistent with biblical history and the biblical time frame. All I would encourage you to do is look at some of the literature over there. There's a very good book called The Young Earth, which is written about from a geology perspective. It's excellent, very, very good. I have read it. I wouldn't be recommending it otherwise, by John Morris, a PhD geologist. And also on the issue of starlight and time, for me that's not a problem. If you've got a God who's all-powerful, God can create light, and he can create planets and stars and galaxies, and he can do it all in an instant. He could have taken no more than a tiny fraction of a second to create all things. He chose to take as long as 6 days, which is an interesting question. Why does an all-powerful God need 6 days? Well, he doesn't need 6 days. He stretched it out over 6 days to give us a pattern for our working week. And that's another point, because if we didn't have a 6-day creation, and Exodus 20:11 picks up on that, you work for 6 days, for the Lord God made the heavens and earth in 6 days, then we wouldn't have good solid reasons for why you don't have an 8-day week or a 10-day week. And so it's a massive debate, and I just would encourage you to, I'm sure you have already, but explore further. I do believe the young earth view, as it's called, is a credible view, scientifically. I don't find I'm having to hide my head in the sand and ignore science. I can honestly say that, and I'm sure Florian would say the same. But we won't convince everybody in a single day's talk, so I know that too. I would say, though, and you made a comment about Assemblies of God, it would be very refreshing if all denominations like Assemblies of God and Elim's another one, and other denominations would come out and say, this is what we believe. Sadly, when it happens, it's almost always, in my view, the wrong belief. It's the Bible must be understood in a modern way. And that takes away from its authority, to quote from Steve at the beginning. It's an authoritative word. If we start, what are we doing? We're taking man's authority and we're elevating it above the word of God's authority. And that's an issue to really seriously face up to. All of us have to face up to that. Long answer. Maybe there's a few other people who've got questions, and we can talk separately. Yes.
Thank you for very well communicated. I just have a question about interpretation and how we understand Genesis. You said Genesis is not a scientific textbook, but the details from the Christian. I just wondered how...
The sequence of events, the order.
Yeah.
and the plain statements. Yeah.
So I just wondered about the original writer of Salutations to Moses and the original audience. Presumably didn't have modern science in mind when they were writing. So I just wondered.
Yeah, it's not. That's true. They didn't have to, though, did they?
I just wondered why sort of young earth creationists read it with modern science in mind if it wasn't originally.
No, I tell you how I read it. The truth is, I read it the way the New Testament writers read it. And we know how. If you're taking, some of you have got notebooks, jot down some verses and look them up. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 4 and 5. Mark 10 verse 6. Those are parallel passages where Jesus defends a biblical Christian view of marriage, and he refers back to Genesis 1 to do so. He says, have you not read, he who made them at the beginning of creation made them male and female. So man and woman made at the beginning of creation. Luke 1 verse 70. Zacharias, father of John the Baptist, his tongue's just been loosed, and he says, God has spoken by the mouth of all of his holy prophets since time began. From of old, in the Greek it's eons, so it's from the beginning. Luke 11 verse 50. This is Jesus speaking again, and he says, God had sent prophets in that passage, including Abel, but their blood had been shed by their opponents. Since the foundation of the world, the blood of the prophets was shed. So, and he mentions Abel. So prophets were there from the foundation of the world. Romans 1:20, you've got Paul speaking. He says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly seen. So there's no excuse, he goes on to say, not to believe in a God. Well, there's no excuse because people have been there since the creation of the world to clearly see God in his creation.
Would Jesus interpret Genesis in the light of modern science?
No, but Jesus taught that mankind was there at the very foundation of the world, very beginning of creation. Paul taught that man was there since the creation, and there was no excuse not to believe in creation. And that we could quote other scriptures. There's a little booklet called 15 Reasons to Take Genesis as History, which I recommend on that point. And what that's saying is the New Testament writers read Genesis as history. So if I want to know as a man in the 21st century, how do I read Genesis? Surely the very first thing I should do is go to the New Testament and see how did they read Genesis, including the Lord of glory, Jesus himself. Because if I find myself with a different point of view than Jesus, I would submit to you that I'm in deep trouble. Deep trouble. Because I'm going to stand before him one day and give an account for every idle word I've spoken. Well, why did you not believe my word? Why did you teach people that Genesis didn't take place as it says? Sorry, history is not as it is in Genesis. Why didn't you believe that people were there at the beginning of creation when I clearly taught you that it was the case? Oh, but Lord, I trusted other men and women that were very intelligent, honest people, nice people in my church. And they taught me something different. Well, you should have trusted me. It's not a salvation issue, but it's a serious issue. If you want to be blessed of God, do God's will. Believe his word. If that's the path to blessing, I want to know the blessing of God in my ministry. I don't want to be found disobedient. And I know that's treading on some toes here, but I look at what I used to believe, and I honestly believe I can understand it's a hard one to face up to, but I had to face up to it, and it was hard. It was a struggle. It was a crisis in my faith, because I didn't want to believe it. But when I did, all I can say to you is that I knew the truth of Jesus' words, that you could be set free. It was liberating. And I remember thinking, wow, you can believe it. And that's never been the case that I've closed the doors of my mind to science. It just made me more interested in science. You think of the great Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, the great scientists of the past. They thought they were thinking God's thoughts after him when they believed his word. And they were believers in a 6,000-year creation. That's not because they didn't know anything about science. They are the fathers of their scientific disciplines. They knew a lot about science. And there were many men in Darwin's day who didn't accept Darwin's views as scientists. It was the church that quickly capitulated to evolution. The scientists are much slower to accept evolution, which is not so well known today. I don't know how much longer I've got. I'm looking at this and it says it's probably fini, isn't it? Is there one more question?
Yeah.
One more? Yes.
As I look at creation and try to, in some respects, understand, look at the evolutionist arguments and creation arguments and so on. But obviously, as I look at biblical view, in terms of obviously understanding God created,
Yeah.
could I be led to believe, in terms of the way that God then created it, He created it with an age?
Okay. Like an appearance of age.
Yeah. So the thing that God's put on it,
Yeah.
has just got.
Yeah.
In terms of, because I guess as science looks into it, I guess it potentially could originally find a date to say this is when it was originally created.
Yeah. Well, okay, a good question. Can I answer your question and promote our magazine? Shamelessly do this at the same time, okay? Okay. I do believe that this is the type of thing you need to have to answer all the questions you guys have asked have all been exactly the kind of thing that people ask. And the magazine's not written just for people who have signed up and said, yeah, I believe this. It's for everybody. I can honestly say we've had testimonies over the years of atheists coming to Christ because they've read the magazine. That didn't save them. God saved them, but it broke down their barriers. And they could see the truth of it. So it's a colourful family magazine. It has a section for several pages called Focus, which takes you through some of the most recent reports in the scientific media, and we show you how to understand those from a biblical perspective. Articles on animals, articles to do with geology and astronomy and biology and so on. But also, we always have an interview with somebody who is a creationist. In this case, it happened to be a pole vaulter for Australia, but a committed Christian. It's a bit of human interest. And this is one that deals with Noah's Ark, not so much on the geology, but how it's a story, how it's an account that connects with our salvation. Why are there thorns and thistles? Were they in the world before the curse, as evolutionists would teach? Or are they the consequence of God's curse, as we read in Genesis chapter 3? Why are there prickles? 4-page children's section on that issue. So children can be equipped to share and defend what they believe. Cats, big and small. Did you know that your domestic cat is related to your lion and your tiger and your ocelot and your jaguar and your puma and every other cat in the world through an unbroken chain of crossbreeding, hybrids? Your domestic cat is only 6 hybridizations removed from a tiger. It can't breed with a tiger, but it can breed with a margay, which can breed with an ocelot, and so on until you get to a tiger. So they're all the same kind. Some people say that's evolution, but it's still cats. Different species within the same kind. That's very important. We haven't gone into that today, but that's the sort of thing we do. Fossils. Transhumanism. Is this the next step of our evolution? Some people are talking about transhumanism, where you get implanted technology into our heads and brains and parts of our body. Sounds yuck to me, but some people want this. And how did the waters shape the continent? This was a recent issue. And also, Bible. You know a tree by its fruit, says Jesus. Bad tree, bad fruit. Good fruit, the tree's good. And that relates to this subject. Famous scientists of the past. So that was the issue, also the last issue that had that article by me. We get testimonies of people who say it helped them become a Christian. We get testimonies from people who say, it got rid of my doubts. It's bad to have doubts because you can't have a rock-solid confidence in sharing your faith with other people because you're afraid that someone's going to throw you a curveball, as the Americans say, and you won't know the answer. But when you're confident in what you believe, you're confident in evangelism. You're confident in witnessing, and that's brilliant. Evangelism becomes easy. This guy says, I just give a creation magazine to somebody, and next time I see them, we talk about it. Or you send them an email with an article and talk about it. And even children enjoy it. So, friends, I encourage you to have a look at this magazine. It's £14 for 4 issues quarterly. So every 3 months it lands on your doorstep, and you can get it digitally as well, just for an extra £3 for a year. And that means you can see it on your iPad or tablet or computer just as it would appear in the magazine. All the links are clickable, of course, and live, and you can search past issues really quickly. So it's a handy tool. You can also send articles on to other people in your family or friends as a form of evangelism. And also, you can share it on up to 5 devices in your home with one subscription. If you subscribe today, we'll give you a free back issue. And if you subscribe for 3 years, you'll get a DVD from a series of those over there that are choice. So I'll start answering that question in a moment. But Gavin, for speed, is going to send around a few clipboards. Well, we won't do this again today. This will just be done now. And if anyone's interested, you just need to put your name and address and how many years you want it for, whether you want it digitally or not, and then take it over to Gavin, and you can settle up, and you can be walking away with one of those back issues with you. Now, that is a great way of keeping up to date on the issue. Yes, there are all sorts of books, and I particularly recommend the following in relation to what I've spoken about today. What on earth is God doing? Making sense of a troubled world, a biblical Christian worldview. It's a great 40-page booklet for those who don't read a great deal but want the information bite-sized. I recommend this highly. It covers lots of stuff. Some science, biblical history, the big issues, why is there death and suffering in the world? How do you share your faith in this world? What about the gospel? That's an 80-page book, Intelligent Answers for Open Minds. Yeah, evidence for creation. There is evidence for creation. This is a great book. It's a colourful book on the outside, but inside it's a magazine format with 30 Bible-believing PhD scientists from all different sorts of disciplines, colourfully laid out, and I highly recommend that. That's a great resource because people often think that no serious scientist believes the Bible. And if you want answers to commonly asked questions, if you're not able to get the magazine, at least get the Creation Answers book. That's probably the textbook of our ministry. It's not a textbook in the sense that it's for eggheads. It's a textbook in the sense that it covers all the questions we're normally talking about. So I do recommend that. There are all sorts of others. There's commentaries on Genesis. There's DVDs on different subjects. Some of them are documentaries. And there's a website which you can get on your various devices as well. So, that question, the appearance of age. God clearly did put the appearance of age in his creation. If you turned up on day 7 in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve would have been fully formed human beings. I don't know, they'd have been in the prime of life, wouldn't they? 25? What's the prime of life? I'd have no idea. I know I'm past it. Probably they didn't have belly buttons, I suspect. Are you sure you're the first man, Adam? Yep. There you go. They wouldn't have needed a belly button. But they had the appearance of age. The trees that you'd seen growing in the early days, if you'd cut them open, I don't suppose there would have been tree rings, because tree rings, the winter growth and the autumn growth produce the dark and the light wood, respectively, of the tree rings. They're not, for most plants, a structural support, though in some stems they might be. So tree rings probably wouldn't be there. But to all other intents and purposes, those trees would have appeared mature. God created them with their fruit within them, with the seed within themselves. So there's no deception, however. I'm not saying you were saying it was deceptive, but God had created a mature-looking creation that to us would have looked old based on our current way of thinking, based on our life experience. Because to start from simple beginnings would have taken a long time before you had people that could worship him, and he wanted people to worship him. That was the pinnacle of his creation. So he creates a mature-looking creation. Light from the furthest star, say 12 billion light years away, I believe the size of the universe is truly massive. I don't think it's an exaggeration. Jeremiah says that it's a universe that can't be measured. The stars are uncountable, the Bible says. So it's a huge universe, but I don't have an explanation for how Adam could look up and see Orion and the other constellations on day 6. I believe he could. We're told in Job 9 verse 9, Amos 5 verse 8, that God made Orion, he made the Pleiades, he made Arcturus, the Great Bear, he made his constellations. So they are substantially the same now as they were when Adam could have looked at them on day 6 as a fully formed, brand new human being. How does God get the light from stars that are physically separated by billions of light years, which is a distance, to Adam's eyes on the 6th day? I've got no idea. But is that a problem? Just because I can't understand how Jesus turned water into wine, and I can't understand how he walked on water, and I can't understand how he made 5 loaves and 2 fish into enough food for thousands of people, doesn't mean I don't believe it. There's no scientific explanation for those miracles. Dead men don't rise. There's no scientific explanation for the resurrection. There's no scientific explanation for the virgin birth. All of those are miracles, and we as Christians believe them without a problem. Most true Christians believe those without a problem, don't we? Because of the words of Scripture. And I believe it's exactly the same for the miracles of the Old Testament. At the time of Elisha, Moses, and way back, the ultimate miracle, of course, was the creation of the world. Genesis doesn't pretend to be anything other than a miraculous account. God speaks things into existence by the breath of his mouth. Psalms 33:6 and Psalm 33:9. God is not telling us that he did this in a process, step-by-step way. He speaks and things happen. And I think, I've just finished with this, but Jesus stood up in the boat, and it was a stormy sea, and he was sleeping. How do you sleep in a boat? You must have been really tired. And he says, "Peace, be still." And instantly there was a great calm. If it had only gradually calmed down, the disciples wouldn't have been on their faces saying, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." It's because it instantly calmed down against everything we know about meteorology, everything we know about the time it takes for a stormy sea to calm down, oceanography. It contradicted the laws of science as people can understand, but it happened, declaring his creatorship. And they knew they were in the presence. I mean, it's interesting, when Peter saw that catch of fish, what was his response? And the nets were bursting. "Depart from me, O Lord, I'm a sinful man." He knew he was in the presence of a God who was just way beyond him. When God does miracles, it gets human beings' attention. And we're in a world today which wants to take away the miracles, which is a real tragedy. Our rightful response to a creator who creates by speaking is that we worship him. But would you be inclined, and I will finish with this, would you be inclined to worship a God who created over millions of years of death and bloodshed and disease and suffering and survival of the fittest and death of the unfit? Would that be a God who cares about suffering? I have to tell you that I think there's a big problem for believing that God would have created by evolution in terms of the kind of God I worship and serve. So that's a lot of issues that go way beyond what your question was, but I hope that's dealt with the why it matters to some extent. Do look at the literature. I've taken much more time than I should have done, but thank you for your patience.